welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayat. On this episode, I speak with Canadian entrepreneur, business mentor, and veteran Brice Scheschuk. Born and raised in Regina, Saskatchewan, he was adopted at birth and had a wonderful childhood with a loving family. He knew in high school he wanted to do something in the business world, and upon graduation, went to the University of Regina. Before starting university, he joined the Naval Reserve and fell in love with the profession of arms. This motivated him to take a gap year to finish his Navy training, and then he transferred to Dalhousie University to finish his education. After graduation, he got the entrepreneurial bug and was involved in numerous startups over the years, culminating with the co-founding of Wind Mobile. After selling the company, Brice has focused his time and energy on investing in and mentoring new companies to help them succeed in business. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Brice Scheschuk. Bryce, welcome back to the show.
Perfect start.
So for the listener, Brice and I did this was a few months ago. I think it was before summertime, and we had an awesome conversation. He was in Toronto. In fact, I think you were my first virtual guest, and it was an epic fail because I lost your entire side. And God knows no one's going to tune into a 2-hour podcast just to hear me talk every 5 or 10 minutes.
With big pauses in between.
Right. Hey, great to be able to catch you here in person in Ottawa, and appreciate you coming in for round 2. We were just talking about this, but you're into town for SAS North, so maybe what is SAS North if people don't know?
Yeah, happy. So in Ottawa for what I think it's been many years now. SaaS, which stands for Software as a Service, which is a very known tech term, basically subscription software sold typically to businesses. It's a huge industry globally, and Canada shows up reasonably well on it. We do an annual conference in Ottawa, and I was speaking at this conference. And basically, as I was saying to you earlier, it's almost reunion-like for me because I know so many people in the ecosystem. I've been at it for so long that you just pluck off, see people you know, catch up. Sometimes you meet some interesting founders, whatever the case may be.
Okay. What were you talking about? What was your topic?
So my topic right now is that I'm speaking about publicly. This was the 14th time I've done it this year, and it's actually the topic I'm most passionate about publicly right now, and it's the one that I've been pulled to and is resonating the most of anything I've spoken about in the last decade. And it's called Founders Play Your Own Game. And what I saw happening in the tech ecosystem in Canada was over the last, I'll say, started a decade ago, but it kind of grew and grew and grew, is this narrative has taken hold where to be a successful founder, it means you need the validation of having raised institutional venture capital, put yourself on a certain growth treadmill, and away you go. And that became the all-consuming narrative for founders.
What's institutional venture capital?
Yep, great question. So companies need to finance themselves.
Yep.
Okay. There's equity and debt, the two big deltas, right? The two different types of financing that you typically do. Mm-hmm. Equity, issuing shares for capital to use to grow your business can happen to a number of different parties on the other side of the table. There is a structured market called the institutional venture capital market that basically has evolved over the last, really actually 50 years, but really on steroids over the last 20, that funds high growth startups that are looking to innovate. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Classic example is Uber.
Yeah.
Think about Uber, okay? This young guy named Travis Kalanick and a good Canadian named Garrett Kemp run around Silicon Valley, and they're like, we have this idea. We're going to use a tech platform to allow you to hail cars, strangers, to come and pick you up and take you to a destination. There's a payment involved, and it'll be a better service than a taxi. First of all, that must have been a very interesting pitch to land. Think how hard that would be. Wait a second. Let me get this straight. A stranger in a Corolla is going to show up at my house and pick up my daughter and take her to a party. Right. So the beauty of a thing in this ecosystem is we call them outlier companies. Uber is obviously an outlier company. The pitch makes no sense.
Right.
And no one understands it at the time, but in hindsight, it all looks like a genius.
Right.
The capital that funds those kinds of businesses is called venture capital. what happened is call it in the mid 2010s, the capital flowing into that asset class really increased. There were quite a few wins from an exit, so from selling them ultimately, Uber being a big one, Airbnb, DoorDash, all name brand companies that we now know. And it caused more capital to flow. And it kind of took over this narrative where the only way you can be successful is to be like an Uber.
Right.
And the reality is that is actually insane. And that doesn't make sense. And we didn't have a balancing narrative to that because we'd kind of all swum up a river or down a river this way. And I said, I got to swim up the river and kind of go against the current and put a balancing narrative. And I've never had founders basically come out of that and they feel a bit liberated and they realize that there's many, many ways to finance your business and there's no one size fits all. And quite frankly, they start to understand the business model of high growth. And it's a pretty hard business model. You could imagine how many failures there are in that. So it's a 45-minuter. I use a lot of deal examples. I'm very blunt when I speak and we have a lot of experience under. I've been at that for 30 years. And so I got lots of examples and I can kind of make some jokes about myself and it lands well. And I'm going to keep doing it for as long as it's needed.
You may be blunt, but that's got to be a hopeful narrative because if you're looking down the barrel of the idea that you have to be a unicorn like a Airbnb, like an Uber, then you may get yourself into this position where you say, well, why am I bothering?
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean it's not hard work, but it seems a lot more attainable when you don't have to be an Uber. You can be a whole bunch of other things.
That is absolutely true. Look, you know the term unicorn. You just used it. That's another example of a narrative taking hold. You have to build a unicorn.
Right.
That's a measure of success. No, you don't. What you have to do is build what makes sense for you, execute effectively, fund your business the way you want to grow it, keep enough ownership such that on exit you have a meaningful return to yourself, and maybe rinse and repeat, or maybe just chill, maybe mentor others after, whatever that narrative is. It is not you have to jam yourself full of this capital and grow at all costs. That is not a fair narrative to founders.
All right, let's talk origin story that gets us to this point here. So, family background, family history, born, raised.
Yep. So, I was born in Regina, Saskatchewan, 1971, and I was born actually to a 16-year-old single mother who gave me up for adoption at birth. And, there's a podcast that I listen to where they ask this question at the end, what is the kindest thing that someone has ever done? And I always think about that answer when I hear it. Just, they're asking this, what if I was being interviewed and God asked that question? Well, although I've never met her, I attribute the kindest thing ever done was a 16-year-old single mother in 1971 going to high school in Regina, Saskatchewan, giving me up for adoption at birth to two 31-year-olds who'd been trying to have children unsuccessfully, and then they adopted me, and they're my parents, and so that's where I started. And within 3 years, they had two biological kids who are my brothers, which I think is a common story, right? The stress relief and so on. And so I did my formative elementary high school years in Regina, Saskatchewan, which for listeners, I think most people who will listen will know this, but it's a small town, Regina, Saskatchewan, capital of that province, which is a very small province. It was an idyllic place to grow up. And I grew up middle class, not too wealthy, also not too poor. So I was right in between, hungry, ambitious, but also not like no issues of poverty or some of the challenges of that. It was just an amazingly perfect spot to be in. Spent 18 or 19 years there.
And what did your parents do as you were growing up?
My dad was a principal of a school.
Okay.
One of those, he started.
Your school?
My school. my elementary school.
Yeah, my mom spent a couple of years as my French teacher.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, I empathize.
Yeah, so here's how that went. So I think it was grade 5 or 6, my dad taught me one class. Okay, and we made it through that whole process of having a parent. If he would have stayed at the school till I was in this Saskatchewan K-8, 9 to 12.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
If he would have stayed till I went to grade 8, he would have been my teacher for grade 8. He left when I was in grade 7.
Yeah.
So that was good. But anyway, he was a middle class principal, started when he was 21. You didn't need a degree at the time. He got his degree part-time, and at 30 years in, so like 51, he was able to retire full pension.
So he didn't need a degree. Was this because they used the teacher's college model back then, where you went and did a year or two learning how to teach?
I don't know how it all worked, but he did his degree part-time while working over many years. So right. I don't know. I don't think he was walking in with really any credentials.
I don't think that's uncommon, because my mom went to teacher's college in Toronto,
right.
like Humber College or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, like when I was in high school, she was finishing her bachelor's at Carleton.
Wow.
In the evenings, and
right.
she was a full-time kindergarten teacher. So I
similar. Sounds similar.
Yeah.
Maybe a thing back then, maybe demand, supply, maybe credentialing was obviously different. Can't explain it. But look, it was great. He was not an absent father. He worked those hours and he was at home, and it was awesome. Super supportive, three boys, lots of sports, lots of interests and so on. He was an amazing dad. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom for many, many years. She had worked, then when we were born, she stopped. And for years, she stayed at home, and then she kind of went back and did some part-time stuff. But again, think about that, right? You've got it's an idyllic situation. Yeah. Super lucky, and recognize now the luck of that whole draw.
That's an awesome thing to be able to look back on and speak with such sort of love and reverence of your childhood and your parents.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
And I tell you, the more I look around me and see some of the challenges, the more I recognize it. And look, I'm lucky. They're both 84 years old this year. They are both healthy. They are mobile, cognition. I try to see them 2, 3, 4 times a year.
Yeah.
Just all of it is great. Still married, holy smokes.
Yeah.
So cool. And look, they came from farms, small town farms in Saskatchewan. And so a lot of long life in that. Sadly, I don't get those genetics, right? My genetics come from somewhere else.
Right.
But like my great grandmother lived till 90s. My great grandfather, who I knew reasonably well, lived into his 90s. Grandparents lived really long lives. So I got
relationships with them too, which is amazing.
Farmers saw that whole side of life differently, different than being in the city. And again, my grandfather would have been a very early mentor, idol of mine. He was the strong farmer, strong, solid farmer type. So all of this is sometimes when I say it, I'm like, am I making this narrative up? Like, am I in hindsight overdoing it? I feel like it was a pretty honest narrative.
Yeah.
And so that's where I started. And then in the summer after graduating high school, we were all trying to figure out jobs at this point as kids.
Did you have a vision when you were in high school about I'd love to do this or that or
right.
whatever?
Yeah, good question. I was drawn to business, and I feel like I think I've told this story a few times. When I was in high school, I was a math kid. The numbers came to me. You threw Shakespeare at me, big problem. Brain didn't work that way. You threw algebra, calculus, and that was my Shakespeare. So I was in a class in accounting in high school, and just the whole system of how all of that worked started me down this road to thinking about business, and I never really wavered from that. I don't know why, but I knew I wanted to do something in business, and I wanted to go to business school. So there was never any confusion about where I was going to apply and so on. So when I graduated, I got into the University of Regina.
Okay.
And my first summer job not my first summer job. My summer job post high school was this thing that you will know well called the Canadian Naval Reserve.
Right.
Okay. And I thought of it as a summer job. I didn't really know what I was walking into, but probably 5 or 6 of us applied from my high school. I don't know who figured it out. We told everyone, and like 5 or 6, most of us got in. And so a bunch of friends walk into this reserve program in the summer of 1989 in Regina, Saskatchewan at HMCS Queen. People don't realize in Canada there's these land ships around the country that are the reserve units, right? Yeah. And you get your training and you do this, and then you eventually go to the coasts. So that was summer job 1989. I got to tell you, I really liked it.
And I've always been fascinated by kids from the prairies who join the Naval Reserve.
I didn't see.
Maybe it's so you can see water.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Right, you're sailing on a Lake Diefenbaker, stuff like this, and so and there's Army stuff going on, but I never was exposed to it. I don't know how it again. I can't remember exactly how it happened. So I'm doing my training, I'm having a good summer, and a bunch fell off at the end of the summer. They didn't keep going. I really enjoyed it. I'm like, I got a part-time job. They pay well for the time.
Yeah.
And so I go to the University of Regina. I'm doing my business degree, year one, and living at home. And I've kind of felt like an extension of high school in many ways, right? And then I applied for officer. Somewhere in that first year, someone said, "Hey, you should take a nod for the officer training." So I did. I got accepted, and then the summer of 1990.
Yep.
So I'm 1 year through college. I go to Victoria, BC. And the reserve officer training boot camp at the time, I think it was Chilliwack for Regi Force at the time.
Yep.
Albert Head, just outside of Victoria. I don't know if you know that place or know that.
I've been there a few times.
Okay. Yeah. So I lived there for the summer.
Yeah.
And I did the officer boot camp. And I got to tell you, I was loving it. But that was the important thing of that summer that I always think back on is, again, I'm out of the house. I got my freedom. I was out of Saskatchewan, which is a pretty small place.
What a location.
Great location. Loving Victoria. Stunning.
Yeah.
Meeting all these people. You know, one thing about Canada, all these reserve units. Joliet, Quebec, I'll never forget. Met some guys from there. Quebec City, Montreal, Sept-Îles, Trois-Rivières, like all these places, never even heard of. Embarrassingly. Right. We're all rammed on the coast. We're all young. We're all learning. We're all having fun. We're all meeting each other, new cultures. It was amazing. And I realized I couldn't go back and do another year in Regina, back to my old routine. That hit me hard.
Interesting.
So,
yeah.
So while there, I said, I want to carry on with the training. So, you know how the reserves have these permanent things you can do, or full-timers. So I said, I'll do all of my maritime surface training in that year. Told my parents. Took a bit to talk about dropping out of school. Gap years were not a thing back then. And my dad's pretty old school on education, to his credit. But I did drop out. They were supportive. Packed up a little car that I had, drove back, and did all my Mars training in that 8 months.
Okay.
Got the watchkeeping ticket. And while there, I was falling in love. Like, I really liked Victoria, but I kept interacting with people from Halifax, right? A lot of Navy in Halifax, obviously. And I somehow got either convinced or I wanted to do this, I'd never been there, but I wanted to go to Halifax, and I applied to Dalhousie. One school only. Thank God I got in. Because then I would have had 2 gap years. So I got in, and I went into the business. No dispute of program, still the same logic. And I started working at I started studying Bachelor of Commerce, Dalhousie University, whatever that is now. Went to Halifax for the summer, worked for the reserves. Actually, using my watchkeeping ticket for the first time. 3 years at Dal. Summer 2 in Halifax, I did my minor war vessel navigating officer course, which was amazing training. Loved it.
Was that on Yags?
We were on...
I may not be saying that right.
We were on... What the hell boat was I on to do that?
I forget what they were called. I don't know if
it might have been on the pig boats. It might have been on the pig boats, if you remember those. So we probably don't want to go down too much the Naval Reserve quality of ship of that era. The Yags, the PCLs, patrol craft lights or whatever they were called, and the pig boats. And then they had the Moresby and the Anacostia, and then they put that new program in place that were the minesweepers or whatever. I was just before that. These were low quality.
So what was being sailing on the West Coast by sailing on the East Coast? Do you have a preference? What were the differences?
The East Coasters all made jokes about the West Coasters. Sandy bottom sailors. They had these terms for it. Basically, it was an easier sail. Look, it was, what would I say? I like them both. I will say the West Coast, when you're sailing inside passage between Victoria and Vancouver, is freaking beautiful.
It's hard to beat.
And it's hard to beat. Okay, let's compare this. I got to tell you one story. So it's actually embarrassing in some ways. We're in Halifax. I guess it must have been that second summer. And we sail from Halifax to St. John's, just normal training, okay? St. John's, Newfoundland. And we sail there, and we're in these 2 boats. the rally and the relay, sailing together. And we got to, and I think one had a leak in the hull. We get to St. John's, and they had to get an architect to take a look at this. And they're like, you guys can't sail these things until we fix a bunch of stuff. You'll love this one. August of whatever year it was, we get told that we are not allowed, the boats are being fixed while we're fully being paid for something like 2 or 3 weeks. Oh, yeah. And we're hanging out in St. John's. And we had to go through the motions of like duty and all that kind of stuff. It was a crazy fun 3. St. John's is a great city, as you know, and it was amazing. But the story that I'm really telling is we go to leave, so they get fixed. We go to leave. We leave harbor, St. John's Harbor. We get out, and the way I used to do, the way that there were 3 officers on each of these ships. I was the junior. There was a captain, an executive officer, and a naval. I was the naval. Okay. And I don't know if I have a pain threshold, but the way the way the duty shifts work and then the watchkeeping shifts work in the Navy is there's the 8 till midnight, the midnight till 4, and the 4 till 8. Okay. No one likes the midnight to 4 because it breaks your sleep up perfectly in 2. I happen to like that watch because I like the night. Okay. No light. I like the darkness, and it's calm. It's peaceful, and there's going to be an officer on the other ship. We're hanging out together. It's a small crew at that time. Everyone's asleep, and I don't know why, but I just liked that setting. So we leave, and the seas were the roughest I've ever been in. Like, I don't remember how high the waves were, but I mean, you might embellish it as you get older with these stories. It was crazy. The captain got seasick too easily, which is weird, but that happens in the Navy sometimes. So he was taking the 8 till 12. He asked me to relieve him, went down to sleep. So I'm now up at whatever time it was. Probably, I'm going to guess it was 9 or 10. And the boat is truly heaving. I'm talking to the guy in the other boat, and we're like thinking about what to do. Like, this is not cool. And then we see the tip of a little ice cap. Okay. And we're like, no, we're making a command decision here. We have the safety of the boat, right? As the watchkeeper on duty. And we said, we're going to pull the chart out. There's no electronic stuff going on very much at this point. Yeah. Find the closest bay. We're ducking in. And so we do this where he goes first. He drops anchor in this bay. Fully, like, pretty young guys making this decision, and captains are really struggling to function here. And then I came in, and water immediately calm, right? You're in the bay. And the captain, sir, come on up. We made a change to plans here. He comes up, and we were pretty close. I want to say a couple hundred yards off of me pulling alongside his ship at anchor, which is a routine that takes a bit of skill. And he took over, and we cruised in. And then the next morning, we stayed overnight there. The next morning we went. It was perfect. And so when I think about the East Coast sailing, I think about this. It's a rougher place to sail. Now, look, mid-Pacific, I never did. Right. But it was rough. I liked it. It's a harsher sail. Yeah. Weather's worse.
Yeah, St. John's is great place to spend time. I was there recently. Nice. And there's 2 things that, one, I thought that I don't think I had a bad meal or a bad cup of coffee. It was amazing. The restaurants, the cuisine, the food scene there was great. And then I was up on Signal Hill. I went up for a run in the morning, and I was amazed because I went up over top of the gap into the harbor there. Oh, yeah. It is tiny.
It's tiny.
It's tiny.
Small.
I don't think I'd want to take a kayak through there, let alone a warship. Like, it is just insane.
Yeah, it is. So we went through there, parked in that harbor.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was all of that.
That's not for me. I think I found my calling in the Army.
Fair.
So Dalhousie.
So Dalhousie finished that. Okay. After my last summer at Dal, not the graduating summer, the summer before, I shifted gears. And I ended up working for a prof at Dal. I got very into finance. Okay. And he's like, hey, do you want a research assistant for me for the summer? I really like this guy. He was doing some interesting work. Worked for him for the summer, very researchy, academic-y. Enjoyed it. Went back to the reserves for the part-time. And then I knew I had to go to Toronto. Again, back to knowing I had to go to business school, I knew the culmination of that was I had to go to the center in corporate Canada, and I wanted to work financial district. I was enamored with banks and brokerage firms in Wall Street and Bay Street. So 94 was a tough year. We were in a recession economically, and jobs were scarce. I was trying to go for the big boy jobs, the bank trading jobs, the institutional sales. I kept losing to the MBAs. My fault. I wasn't delivering my interviews well. I fully recognize that now. And so I call it a fallback initially, but I applied to 3 accounting firms on Bay Street, and my personality worked better for the accounting firms and the banks.
Okay.
I had my interviews, had my offers, and I went with the one that resonated with me culturally, which is called Coopers & Lybrand at the time, which in current world, we all know PricewaterhouseCoopers. They were 2 different firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Lybrand. I was at that Coopers & Lybrand side pre-merger.
Okay.
2 years in auditing banks and brokerage firms, Goldman Sachs Canada, Bank of Montreal, these kinds of things. Ground hard. I had to catch up on accounting because that wasn't my degree. I had to write the exam, and they work you like heavy. In that era in particular, this whole articling kind of rite of passage, it was intense. But I was living in Toronto. I had some money. I was like, it was awesome. You know, right. The 4 years, the first 4 years from out of university, before you have to settle down, I found to be some of the most fun years of my life. I just love that time. And then,
is it a similar approach now? So if you were
starting now
just coming out of university now, would it be a similar look and feel to in an accounting firm like that?
I'm not fully sure of it, but I know that there's talk a lot about balance in the world now, and I think it's hit the accounting firms. I think they still struggle to give the balance because the workload versus the number of people they can even get to hire that are credentialed and so on seems to not perfectly work. I think it's a grind.
Yeah.
And they lose 95% of their people in the normal attrition into industry and so on, and then if you make it to partner. So I did 2 years in audit, and then I got this opportunity to move to consulting within the firm, which was far more interesting to me. I actually joined a practice run by an ex-South African Navy guy who had come to Canada, also did military in South Africa in a very interesting period of South Africa's history. You may know, I don't know, do you know Phil Grosh?
I do.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
So
We've
Phil,
spoken a few times.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So Phil was a partner, or not a partner yet. He was a manager at Coopers & Lybrand. He had come from South Africa firm to Toronto in the big exodus of South Africans.
Yeah.
And I really liked him, his style, and another guy he was working with named Barry Myers, I think he was a South African as well. And they were building an investment funds practice in the time of the rise of the mutual fund. And they had the practice to be part of. I saw that. I went and worked with them, spent a year, and then they sent me to Boston to work in the global center. It was an amazing year in 98. So 2 things were happening. One, the industry continued to rise, and 2, the euro was coming in. So the European currency amalgamation was happening, big systems challenge, and Y2K was on the horizon. Just a consultant's dream. So I ended up going to Japan, working for Barclays Global, London for the merger of Solomon Smith Barney Asset Management, New York, MetLife.
So
New York Life. Sorry.
Are you fulfilling a similar function in all these different opportunities?
Yeah, kind of. You walk in, there's usually an engagement has been signed to do something. We are looking to change our systems to make sure that when the euro comes in, we have a streamlined thing. You go to do that. There's a set of processes. Okay. Probably not unlike what you're doing, just in a different wrapper. Okay. So I was actually having the time of my life. I was in Boston. I had got a flat. I'd moved to the U.S., full break of my residency in Canada. Okay. I was intending to spend my life in the United States and kind of go the partner track.
Yeah.
And, life throws you some curveballs.
Sure.
So in August of 1998, I got a call from one of my better friends, and he's still back in Toronto, and he was at the firm with me, and he said, time to start a business. And I hadn't really thought of it that way. And, there's a whole narrative around the rise of the internet, .com one, lowering the barriers to entry to entrepreneur. It was the great lowering of the barriers to entry for entrepreneurship was the internet, and the first internet. We started a business. I left the firm, came back to Toronto, and basically from then on have really had the entrepreneurial bug.
Did he have to sell you on the idea, or
not much?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy. He's still one of my business partners.
Okay.
We saw eye to eye, and there was a good idea nurturing, and it was already working. He and another guy had started it and started working in current era. We would call that a side hustle. It was happening while still working, and then there was a moment where, holy smokes, this is working. Time to leave.
So you didn't have to sell you on it. Can I assume then that the real compelling thing was this was based on trust?
There was trust in him in a big way. So I've thought a lot about this because people often ask me, like, what causes one to take that entrepreneurial jump, that risk, and so on. I think that there were a few factors. So for me, I think that it was a bit of a spark. I had done military, as we talked about, and I had done consulting to the biggest companies in the world. So I had seen the bureaucratic lens from the government side and the corporate side, and I was starting to realize I wasn't functioning that well in that environment for a variety of reasons. Okay, so take that as I've tried to think about this a lot. That was one thing. To trust in this guy, having the co-founder, the guy in the foxhole with you that you trust. And look, it's bared out. We started that in 98. What is it now? 2024, 26 years. We've been working together, and we've gone through the whole run together. And there's no, like, we're so far down a path. We know we finish each other's sentences, all that kind of stuff. Like we'll never separate. Like we'll go right to the end. So there was that factor. I don't know, again, a lot of this, you can't think how you knew this, but I knew that equity ownership at founders level, if successful, you could never replicate that with salary, or it's very hard to replicate with salary. So I had some thought about the win there and having a bit of control of one's destiny. And like, you're not really reporting to anyone. You own your every single day, which I quite liked. And so, boom, moved back to Toronto. 4 of us came together to start this thing, and we went up and we went down. So we had an okay concept. It did well for a couple of years. We actually took it public in the U.S.
Okay.
So we went do. And then, look, when 2001 hit and the party ended, and there was no capital to keep fueling and financing, I would call it, we were a pretty mediocre second-tier business. We didn't have a durable, the best were failing, and we were definitely second tier. And we lost, it went to zero. So
had you ever, like, in terms of failure, like, how did you handle that? Had you had other sort of, whether it be sort of personal, professional failures, like previously significant ones that had taught you something, or was this sort of a bit of a watershed moment to this point in your life?
This was definitely a bit of a watershed in terms of severity.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thing. Sorry, I should actually go back. One other factor is I had a partner, not a wife. We were super low burn rate, personal burn rate.
Yeah.
And I could take the jump, take the comp cut that you do when you start a business, and it wasn't fatal to me where I was in trouble quickly. Right. I could size everything accordingly. Big factor in entrepreneurship. There's a whole narrative around that. Okay, so take all of that. So, it's interesting. I feel like, 2001, I'm 30 years old, okay, pretty young, and I feel like it wasn't that bad for some reason. And I always had this thing in my mind as a chartered accountant, and I think partly I needed this. I had this backstop where you can always get a job as a chartered accountant. I wasn't really thinking about 3 lost years of the equity compounding. I think I really looked at it as it was an experience to be learned from. And we actually had taken a bit of money out through some sales of shares and so on. So it was not maybe as fatal as I would say taking it a personal full zero. The layoffs were terrible. You learned a lot about how to do that kind of stuff,
Right.
and we did it all wrong.
The human aspect
all
of
that.
it.
What you
Yeah.
realize, though, is that people are so resilient and adaptable and flexible. When they're laid off, they all find jobs quickly.
Right.
So you learn these kinds of things. So you know what? I really felt that it was, what I did after is I ended up with the guy that I had called me in that August of '98. We set up an office in his house, and we started to build this investment company together right after. So we were back at it within days, and then after he had made a little more money than I have because he had more ownership and sold a bit more. I felt I was starting to get uncomfortable with my burn, and so I put the feelers out, got a job, and I continued the side hustle with him while I was working. Not my favorite job. It was a bit of a dry period for tech after the failure of after .com 1.
Yeah.
Took me about a year and a half, and then I met my current business partner that I'm most known for in the ecosystem, a gentleman named Anthony Lacavera, still working with my old business partner, Dave. And Dave and Anthony are good friends, and we've co-invested in deals together on all sides and so on. So it all worked. But I don't feel like there was this really catastrophic personal failure moment that set me back a couple of years in my mind and so on. I don't feel like it was that style of failure for me personally somehow. I don't know why exactly.
You feel that you need to be, I don't mean this pejoratively.
Not at all.
Obsessive, addicted, whatever, in some way to a certain outcome? Because, I mean, you talk about how a couple days later, like, we were on to the next
Right.
thing. Like, what's the fuel behind that, as opposed to sitting there licking your wounds going, well, that really sucked, and do I really want to, like, jump back into the lake again after
Right.
after almost drowning?
Right.
Okay, what do I do?
Right.
So just curious about the mindset behind that.
No way I can tell you why, but what I can tell you in observation, and I've done a lot of thinking about entrepreneurial resilience over the last 5 years. I was wired more to the stand up from failure and just move on, and it's actually just a learning thing. I was just more wired. I never dwelled on stuff. If there was an obstruction, it was like just okay. It's another obstruction to work our way through. That versus I've seen the opposite, where people like they're broken, and they can be broken for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And I was never the guy to get shattered by this. And again, I can't really tell you why. Did I always have fallback mechanisms in my brain about I always had this foundation that I could go back to? I was never, I can't give you a perfect answer. What I will tell you, though, is if your mindset, and there's no fault, it's who you are as a person. If you are much more of that dweller, shattered by these experiences, you would want to probably think twice about startup land, right? And probably about a lot of what you did.
Yeah.
Right. So in my world, we would definitely want like that stoic narrative of understand what you can control, and everything, that growth mindset is the word I would use to explain it. That's, I think, how I landed more in that world.
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of pieces here. So, I mean, I like to think I have a stoic nature, but I certainly can dwell on things. And you seem to have a stoic nature, but also have that other piece. It's like, okay, move on. Next. Like standing here looking at that isn't going to help anything, so let's move on. And I try and get there quickly, but it sounds like it's almost hardwired in, where you just go, and I'm moving.
I'll say one thing to you. I think on certain things I do that, and on others, though, I'm a bit of a dweller. And it just so happens, though, that this one element, this entrepreneurial stuff of failure, is not where I dwell.
Right.
I do feel, I'll tell you where I dwell, okay? I had a phase where, so in one phase of our company build, there's a saying that I love that I've learned recently. It was a friend of mine said it. He said, outlier founders have to be unrecognizable to their former selves every 2 years. It's a very powerful statement.
Yeah.
It made me think a lot about our scale-up journey. And where I would dwell is we started meeting higher and higher, wealthier people that you would look at and put on a bit of a pedestal in terms of their success and so on. And I would dwell on how I would handle my contact with them. So if I had a meeting and I felt like I'd done something that flubbed, I really had some issues to work my way when probably they wouldn't have noticed, cared, or whatever. But I felt I was really critical of myself and how I comported myself and tried to make sure that I was getting better at that, and I was a dweller in that world. But in this one area which counts a lot, which is you implode on something and you got to pick up and go again in entrepreneur land, that one was not my issue.
Okay.
It's more a people thing for me for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Well, I think it could be a bunch of things, right? I mean, I think we're always looking that we don't want to miss an opportunity,
For sure.
right? So I think that's a big one is, with the what could have been. So I don't want to let that one go by. But yeah, people are tough, right? Because reading, especially people you don't know, like reading their body language, understanding what they mean by certain things, especially if it's in a short meeting. It can be interpreted so many ways.
Totally.
It's a tough. It's definitely a tough
I also
one.
think that. So I've learned the term power dynamic in recent era of, again, back to some of this resilience stuff. And the power dynamic imbalance in my mind, I think I've realized in those circumstances, I'm a young guy. I'm in this room with this Egyptian billionaire. He's had global success. I'm walking in with the wrong frame of mind to start with. I say that to mentors and mentees now a lot. It's my view of mentorship, my job in helping other mentors get better is to level the power dynamic. You literally, the problem with it, like the name mentor and the name mentee already set the stage. And it's like you got to do everything in your power to level that. And I think that's a lot of years of learning and realizing. And it is what look, you walk into some guy in Cairo who's at the time, I think he was worth $10 billion. He rolls around with the world leaders. He's done so much credentials. I just was nervous at that stuff, and I dwelled on it just by style. I think I've gotten better at it. I have a lot more confidence in what I've done and my ability to comport myself. But that would be where I had my weakness, I would say, in a way.
Now, so you have this. You guys dust yourself off. You keep moving on. What's the first big sort of win in your eyes that you had after that? The thing that really sort of cemented, I'm in the right place.
Yeah, so it wasn't that job that I took. Although great group of people,
Sure.
Usual stuff, but it was back to the salary man, right? I get a call from a recruiter. I laugh at this story. A year and a half in, it's like I gotta get out of here. I gotta get back to what I was doing. So I get a couple of inbounds, and there's a lot of corporate-y inbounds that are the same thing I'm doing, just somewhere else. It's not worth it.
Right.
And then I get this call from a guy who he gets credit to this day because it's one of those ones that happened. And he said, you got to meet this young telecom entrepreneur named Anthony Lacavera. He's building something interesting, and he's a dynamic guy or something like this. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So I go and I meet Anthony. We have lunch, and we really hit it off, I think. It was a good lunch. He explained kind of what he was looking for, and it was done the way, it wasn't a prescriptive HR style interview, right? It was like you and I talking kind of thing. And I was really wanting to get out. His timing was perfect. And importantly to me, I'm like, I see a guy building something, and I didn't get hung up on comp, and I didn't get hung up on over negotiating equity or anything like that. I said, look, I'm going to come out, pay me a fair wage. Let's work together for a little while. Let's see if we're compatible. And if we are, then I'm very, very interested in kind of going the distance. And thankfully, it kind of went that way. So he, very ambitious, really good personality matches in the sense that what he was strong at, I was weak at. What he was weak at, I was strong at. And we just created this. It was just a great partnership. It is a great partnership. And so we get together. There's a lot of cleanup to do. To his credit, he built a company from zero to about 30 million in revenue in 5 years, and had every problem, and had to do a bit of a reset of the people side. So I came into that with a couple other guys, and we spent a year cleaning up the company And then we had this foundation set, and we had no constraints, and we went on this 4-year rampage of buying companies and growing that I probably would say was the most fun. We had some external shareholders. They were very like-minded. They were role models in a way. We were small enough that we weren't bureaucratic. We weren't fighting Rogers, Bell and TELUS in their main business. So it wasn't as tough of a fight, if I can call it that. And we were smaller. And so we were young. We were partying all the time culturally. We had a pirate ship culture. We had a great group of people. We were all working together. I really look back on that as a fond time.
What did the company do?
Actually, what did it do?
Yeah, so listeners kind of going, okay, got it. What did the company do?
So non-wireless telecom is telecommunications.
Yeah.
Basically, in the 90s, the government started to deregulate what the big guys were selling and allow competitors to come in and sell.
Rogers,
TELUS. Different names at the time, some of them.
Yeah.
SaskTel. Out east, they had, Atlantic Tel, MB Tel, Island Tel, right?
Yeah.
All this kind of stuff. The industry obviously looks a lot different. So we saw these little spots that we could come in, compete around them better than they were. They weren't focused on these niche areas.
Okay.
And we put this all together to a company in 2007 that was doing 120 million in revenue and about 23, 24 million in profit. It was a beautiful business. And we were just having so much fun doing it, just the size and style. And then in 2007, the Canadian government says we need to add some competition to this ridiculous telecom oligopoly that exists in our country. And Harper, to his credit, saw it. And it's such an interesting time. So BlackBerry was the ascendant smartphone.
Yeah.
The iPhone came out in 2007. Okay. And the world was recognizing mobility was the future. And when that smartphone came out in that quality, it was like game over. This is a new world. And Rogers, TELUS, and Bell, highest bill prices in the developed world, highest profit margins, lowest penetration of wireless in the developed world. You'll remember this. You fear to go to the United States and turn your phone on because of the $2,000 roaming bill, right? All of that. So the Canadian government said, we need to. The way you bring a new party into wireless is you do not allow the existing incumbent players to buy spectrum blocks, and you open it up to the market.
So when you say oligopoly, I'm hearing monopoly, oligarchs. Yeah. So a small number of companies that are dominating a market.
That's right.
Is that what this means?
Monopoly one.
Yeah.
Oligopoly a few.
Oligopoly a few. Okay. So the Canadian telecom market dominated by a few.
Yeah. Rogers, TELUS, Bell were the wireless market with a couple of little regionals in their own provinces.
Right.
That was the market. And they were running the perfect oligopoly racket. Sometimes 3-player markets can be quite competitive. They were the masters of managing this.
Is this common in a highly regulated industry like telecom to have these sort of situations?
There's definitely risk of it. Canada was an extreme. And part of the reason it was an extreme is because if you go province by province geographically, it was actually mostly duopolies. And so there was actually only 2 of them competing.
Oh, okay.
There's a whole narrative around this situation. These guys were particularly good at managing this. There are markets where 3 will just beat each other up, and then, or maybe a 4th gets added and they These guys they had a playbook, the likes we've never seen before. And so they open it up. We run around the world, and we got a business plan. We're so naive. I laugh at how naive we were. But again, I give Anthony a ton of credit. He's ambitious, and he's like, look, there's all these foreign ownership restrictions. You need to have Canadians in the deal. We have this little this telecom platform. We kind of fit a nice profile. Let's see what happens. And so we wrote the business plan. We wrote the legals. He is very good at networking and building relationships. And 10 days before the deadline to put a deposit down to be able to bid on the spectrum that you need to operate, we didn't have a suitor yet. We had so many chances, but we didn't have it. And then we met this billionaire in Cairo. And a bunch of pieces fell into place in 10 days, such that, like, I'll give you one example of serendipity. Every telecom global operator has a head of new markets. So the guy tasked with going to new countries to look at entering.
Sure.
His guy was from Peterborough, Ontario.
Okay.
So he knew Canada.
Sure.
And then all these things fell into place. And so we did this crazy blitz for 9 days from whatever, T minus 10 to T minus 1. And we got an agreement done with him through a lot of crazy back and forth. And those are interesting 10 days of our lives. And we had a $215 million funding done about a day or two before the deposit was due. We flew to Ottawa, took a registered check to Industry Canada, which it was called at the time, and said Globalive Wireless, I think we called it, is entering the auction. And no one could believe we had pulled that off.
Are you buying a block in the spectrum? Are you renting it?
Good question. The economics go as follows. There's every flavor, but in the auctions that you read about where there's a whole bunch of money spent, usually you never own forever with you're licensing them from the government, but they are yours. And generally speaking, the real payment is up front, and then you pay a small fee every once in a while on renewal.
Okay.
But once you have them, you have them.
Right.
It's very rare to see that ever go away.
Right.
You wouldn't want that. They're so valuable.
It's like in Leafs seasons tickets.
Exactly.
And you just never give them up.
It's actually really fascinating. The way you buy them is through an auction. So it's an electronic auction, but it's very much in keeping with like putting a paddle up at an art auction. You're doing it with electronics. So, and you buy frequencies and geographies, and that's how they intersect.
Okay.
Okay. And so, that's a high stakes game. There are experts around the world that you hire, PhDs in game theory, that basically come to your office, train you on how to do an auction, and sit with you for months while you're doing the auction. So I spent the summer of 2008 learning how and then executing a bid strategy to buy the spectrum. And we ended up at the end of the summer of 2008 buying $442 million worth of spectrum.
So did the big three before this, did they have to go through this as well in terms of an auction? Because obviously if you have deep pockets, you can outbid anybody.
Right. So go prior to this experiment thing.
Yeah.
Initial origins of wireless, if you can believe it, they were given spectrum because there wasn't really a market yet.
Yeah.
Bell, Rogers, at the early part of the industry. Then governments recognized the value of this, so then they started holding auctions. And some auctions were open, so anyone could come and bid, but in those auctions, basically what kept happening is the big incumbents who already had operations would always win, because of an economic concept called foreclosure value, right? The value to them of keeping others out is so high that they'll pay more than anyone could ever pay to make a business case.
Right.
So
it's a land grab.
It's a land grab. So Rogers, Bell, and Telus would bid against each other and sometimes pay a lot because they want certain things for themselves differently, maybe, and they want more. One wants more spectrum, kind of disrupts the kumbaya. But then in 2008, the government said, we are blocking you from bidding on these frequencies. And that's called a set aside. And that's what allowed new parties to enter. So that's how we got in.
So you got a chunk.
We got a chunk,
spectrum,
as did a number of others. So there were many competitors, which caused some problems. And then basically we went on this, it's a blur now to think and talk about. From 2009 to 2016, we basically put our heads down and didn't emerge into normal society for 8 years. And the stats are in hindsight. It's really, you just don't know what you don't know in the time, right? We hired 1,000 people in the first year. We built a retail distribution network with Blockbuster. We built a network kind of across the country. We fought Rogers, Telus, and Bell in regulatory battles for years. We had foreign ownership issues. We had recapitalization this. We had layoffs at times. We had customer problems all the way through. And the list just went on. And it's the greatest time. It was the greatest, most satisfying project in many ways, and also just hard to think through what the hell happened. It was kind of like that.
Did you ever get a sense while you were in the midst of it of how important these moments are to actually break apart these types of systems, these ability for certain companies to dominate? Because I'll tell you, knowing nothing about your story before this, the thing we probably dreaded most in the military from moving was getting our telecom sorted out at the new place of business, because you'd flip-flop them back and forth between just despising your current provider and then going, okay, I'm going to go with the next provider. And then within a very short period of time, you'd be disappointed by them. And the prices were always ridiculous. So, so I see this sort of, these being important moments in an industry to be able to actually see some meaningful change come in. Did you get a sense of that while you were in it? Was that something that kept fueling you to go through that much work?
It's a great question. So it was an important inflection for the industry because of the dynamics I mentioned going in. And the government saw it, and they had the right intentions. The problem is that pretty much every policy decision made was wrong. And I now understand, I had no idea back then, if you want to introduce competition to a 3-player oligopoly and add a 4th, there's a playbook for how to do it right, and you can't take half measures. And they took a lot of half measures. And Rogers, TELUS, and Bell, and I would do exactly the same as if I was them, they would have had 100 people in their company studying the policies, and everywhere there was a loophole, a half measure or whatever, they'd drive a truck through it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you have to, as the regulator, you have to have the backbone and the steel to stand up to the relentless pressure you will get from them with the policy decisions that you need to make this work. And they just, it's very hard.
Yeah.
Okay. So but what I will tell you then, back to kind of how I was thinking about it, it's rare that I'm the type that have these big grand things that kind of are big theses that I can say I understood something for 10 years and it just made so much sense and I was right. I'm much more of I call myself the fishing net guy, particularly in investing. I kind of put a net out there. I put my brand out. This is what we kind of like, and I see what comes in through the door, and then I look at each one individually. In this case, I would say this was the one time where it was just the obvious North Star to hang on to, which is I want to wake up every single day and kill Rogers, TELUS, and Bell, and in so doing, I am actually helping the average Canadian.
Yeah.
It was this perfect, so I had HR for the back half of the time I was there. I love speaking, and I have a style of doing it, and I had so much fuel. I've never had this much fuel with Rogers, TELUS, and Bell and all the problems we were having to fire up people and just to kind of go at it.
Oh, I bet.
So it was the great North Star of my career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bet it was not difficult for people to have that as their central organizing purpose and just get after it every day. Because you can, whether it be you go to a family meal on the weekend and people are complaining about their service or you're seeing your own bill and going, oh my God, what's going on here, right?
I'll tell you one funny story. Anthony, to his credit, he's like, before we launch, let's set up a website. This is not internet is in for sure, but it's not mobile yet, really. He goes, let's set up a web page. We're going to call it Wireless Soapbox, and we're going to allow Canadians to voice their views of their current providers. It was insanity.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And thousands and thousands and thousands of Canadians came on and just vented about Rogers, TELUS, and Bell. It's just there's just so many of these factors, right, that were there. So that was the, and look, I won't bore you with the whole capital side of it, but we had to recapitalize the business. We had lots of shareholder challenges. Eventually, the Egyptians sold to a Russian and a Norwegian company. So we found ourselves with new partners partway through his interest. And in 2014, we had to exit all foreign shareholders, bring in some new money, recapitalize the debt. And that was a pretty profound moment. Could have gone either. We almost went bankrupt. I was telling the story today at this conference.
Yeah, okay.
In one room in August of 2014, we had a bankruptcy monitor getting prepared to file In another room, we had a bid room with all the bid materials to bring people in to look at the books and look at a consortium type bid. I was 3 weeks away from telling you a completely different story right now. We did not go bankrupt, thankfully. A lot of gymnastics in that time. We got the recap done. And the company at that point, a lot of things had swung in its favor. And really the 18 months after that, August 2014, the wind was behind our back. And we ended up having just win after win. The government really swung to our favor. And Shaw Communications, which was Shaw, Alberta-based, Western Canadian cable, did not have a wireless strategy. And you can't that was 2016. 2016, no wireless strategy. They just missed the whole spectrum thing. They came knocking on the door and they said, okay, you guys are a company. You're the last person standing. Yeah. You have 500 million in revenue. We had 1 million customers, and Shaw, we need a wireless strategy. So we ended up, we hired bankers. They had bankers. We ran very, very detailed, due diligence processes and so on. Negotiated the deal, sold the company, and then it's funny. You fast forward now. We'll talk about all the time after, but you fast forward now and you look at our little fun oligopoly. Rogers owns Shaw. Shaw had to spin off the wireless asset it bought from us, now called Freedom Mobile, to Videotron, right? Bell consolidated Manitoba Tel. Allstream went in another direction. Like, you just go through all of this and you're like, they're the masters. And It's a small industry and they just keep doing what they do better and better. So here we are now. And we have a small... we didn't have, the regret would be, and Anthony would say this, I didn't want to sell. And I would agree with him. We felt we sold for $1.6 billion. I feel we had a $10 billion market opportunity. He may say more. If you look at the combined market caps of Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, I think it's high. I think we could have carved 10 out of that market and just carried on with good government behind us and we were in the more fun part of the build. That said, it went the way it went. It was a great outcome for us. It was the liquidity event, the game-changing exit. You have this wire come into your bank account. For us, it was on March 1, 2016. I didn't know what. It's just like you see this number and it's like, holy smokes. But your job's done. That 1,000,000 miles a minute you're running is now 0. And it's like, that's a whole new world. You and I could spend 3 hours talking about the psychology of an exit and your identity being wrapped up in a business.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, how old were you when?
So you 20, I was 45.
So 45 years old.
Pretty young, I think, in the grand scheme.
Well, certainly way too young to do nothing.
Exactly.
So
it's a core inflection moment. Anthony, myself, and there was a third business partner that was equally important, legal and regulatory, as you said, regulated industry. That role is critical. Simon Lockie also have been working almost as long as I have with Anthony. We came together after, and we decided to stay together as a partnership because we trusted each other, back to trust, and we had good relations. We'd gone through the battle together, and we're like, what do we do in our next phase? And we decided that we would take that capital and build an investment company around it. And that became global. That is Global Life Capital.
Okay. So I think that's a key part right there, is that although you moved on from the last project, you had this team, this small group of people with shared experiences and trust. I mean, I think that is actually where a lot of people end up being challenged with their identity. Totally. Is that they lose. It's not necessarily the thing they're doing, although that can be it, but it's the people they're doing it with. Totally. And if you keep carrying on with the same people, I mean, similar look and feel and relationships and trust, and that's awesome.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
We even had the same name back. So Wind was gone, Freedom was the company name, and we took Global Live back and used that as our name. We had a few good things for continuity and brand.
Now, do you, in this sort of relationship, so do you all sort of agree on these are the things we want to do, or do you have the ability to do sort of side passion projects? How does that How does that sort of work in a business relationship?
Yeah, so what I would say is we have a core platform that has the bulk of the capital. We had more, my role is like writing the memos about strategy as to how to codify what it is we're trying to do, rules of engagement. We actually do have some rules of engagement around if there was a deal and we turned it down as the platform and someone wanted to continue on with it. We actually have had some discussion. It's rare.
Yeah.
It's pretty uninteresting, but we have a general operating set of parameters. And and it's served us well. I would say that there are two comments I would make to this kind of whole narrative. Why I had no idea of if you look at resilience thinking and literature even and research that I've looked at, I've done all of that in recent era. I had no playbook for the best practices. Okay, so I've thought through like we were doing some pretty terrible stuff to ourselves in that era, like in terms of sleep, in terms of stress, in terms of nutrition, in terms of lack of fitness for periods of time when it got really bad and so on. Like the longevity literature now, we would be like the worst from back then. And I say, well, we didn't have any knowledge of this stuff. So what did we do? And I think it was the three of us in our way of working together, understanding each other's strengths and weaknesses, figuring out an operating cadence between us that was very close. And what you know this better than I do, combat situations. I don't want to try to equate it perfectly to that. But the three of us were never going to let the other two down. That was just not the way it was going to go. And we're all pretty tenacious. We're high performance. We want to win. But the way the three of us worked together in like negotiating the deal for that 10 days brought a certain operating cadence. When we almost went bankrupt that summer trying to raise money, it was one of our toughest summers. We had this operating cadence. I could give you three other moments of sometimes months of how we worked together, and they were special. And when I look back, that is the one thing that I'm resolute about, that was this powerful thing coming together. So that is a comment I'll make around then staying together after. It would be undoable for me to build relationships like that now. I don't think. And so that's a lot of effort to think about restarting relationships and so on. And I feel like we manage our egos well, and often the partnerships blow up because one side doesn't think the other side's doing as much, or one side thinks they're better than the other side, or they're smarter than the other side. Thankfully, we've been able to avoid that. Anthony has a certain persona. He's got a certain style. He's got a certain gravitas. I have mine. I don't want to be him. He definitely doesn't want to be me. And I don't want to try to aspire to exactly what he does or what Simon does. I think we're comfortable in our own skin, and we have been almost throughout the project. So that I would say would be a couple of points I would make.
Relationships and that ability to have respect for one another, the way you've just outlined, is so important.
Yes.
I had the infantry instructor at the engineer school when I was going through training. We were at the end of one batch of summer training and doing some other things, and I was having a chat with him, and he was telling me he was going to get married that summer. And I, of course, as a young 22-year-old, and I don't know if I've told this in the podcast before, made some, ridiculously sort of insensitive comment, assuming he'd already been married before, right? And he sort of looked at me, he goes, "Nope, I have not, Mr. Ed. You know why that is?" I'm like, "No, sir, no idea." He says, "Because it's important to choose your fire team partner carefully, right? Don't rush it."
Well said.
Right. And I have...
Perfectly said.
It is.
Yeah.
And as you're saying that, I'm like, there's somebody who chose his fire team partners carefully, and you don't have to worry about it now.
Yep.
And I think that's good for as many relationships in your life as you can, to be discerning and choose your fire team partners carefully, because they won't let you down. And
amen.
That's amazing.
And that includes a lot of things outside of what we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Amen to that. Yeah. I love that comment.
No, it's
I agree.
It's one of those things that to live your life by, without a doubt. Yeah. Now, although we talked, you sort of mentioned mentoring already. Yep. I know that's one of the things that you've devoted some energy to, and I really liked how we sort of opened this, and you talking about, breaking that idea of everybody has to be a unicorn to be successful. Now, what drew you towards spending time helping other entrepreneurs, understand the space, and maybe even giving them a little bit more confidence and they can get things done?
Yeah, 100%. So here's how it goes. Here's how that world went for me. 16 were sold. We've decided to get into the investment world. We've decided to focus a lot on tech, venture, innovation, startups, entrepreneurs, founders. So we have a brand. We've had a big exit in Canada, big deal, a lot of pain, but people kind of respected what happened. So what do? We start going to, in the startup ecosystem over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of structure added. Some of it good, some of it people have, I would argue, could be at issue. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you that in a second. There are names that are well known: Creative Destruction Lab, Techstars, Founder Institute, YC, Y Combinator. These names are well known to anyone who lives in this world. And they bring founders together. They often bring mentors together. There's some structure. Maybe there's some programming, all with the good intent of trying to help entrepreneurs make less mistakes, move faster, be more successful. The issue you have in entrepreneur land is, how we were talking earlier about Uber? Mm-hmm. They don't do as well with that complete contrarian outlier style.
Right.
And often there's a lot to unpack in that. And so the outliers you often don't find in the accelerators, if I could summarize.
Okay.
So, but there's good intent there. So we start speaking at them, we start going and mentoring at them and so on. And I'm back, I'm now mentoring founders, and we're writing checks. I've got them in my portfolio. They're coming into the office and we're talking da. And so you start really developing pretty quickly in what we were doing, this mentor-mentee relationship with a lot of founders. And I'm doing it also outside of this, and with some youngsters. I was starting to have a phase where people in our ecosystem, like someone at PricewaterhouseCoopers that was kind of working in this area, asked me for a little bit of mentorship. And I'm like, great. And so I was kind of really getting into this, a bit of an impacty thing, I thought it was a bit of a give back and so on. Little did I realize, and I'll play this through the story, is first of all, I was doing it all wrong, which I had a revelation in 2018 when I started mentoring at Creative Destruction Lab, which the genius of CDL, which is Canadian, founded out of Rotman in Toronto, is everything you do effectively is with other mentors. So it creates this check and balance. It also creates this mutual learning environment. And there's just all these ways of seeing other mentors and how they do things and understanding how you do things and kind of putting it together is a proper discipline. And I have this memorable day. It was at Dalhousie in Halifax. I went back to that chapter of it, CDL.
Okay.
I go through this day, and there's like 75 people working together as mentors. It's an amazing experience. I'd never done it before. And I walked out of that day, and I'm like, I don't know how to mentor. And I'd mentored like 500 founders by that point. And I'd sold my operating business. Like, we'd gone through the whole run. And it was a slap in the face.
Was it didn't know how to, so to be fair, maybe play devil's advocate,
yeah.
You didn't know how to mentor, or you maybe didn't have an appreciation of how you could mentor? Because I would imagine you were adding value in these discussions as a mentor.
Fair point.
Right?
Yeah. Fair. I definitely wasn't best practice, and I wasn't at high performance. I think, look, I had a lot of founders say they got a lot of value out of it.
Right.
But I didn't know what good way to say it. I didn't know what it could be.
Right.
And I looked around, and I think a lot of other people didn't know what it could be either, if you know what I'm saying. What did I do? I'm a self-actualizer in that way. And so I spent a couple of years really focused on getting better. And I did it primarily through going to places where there's other mentors that I could work with directly. Did some reading, did some research, blah, 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 the stuff we would do. And then in 2020, the pandemic hits. Absolute chaos for the startup ecosystem. Okay. I I did early in the pandemic. There's a community organization called TechTO that organized first virtual town hall I've ever been part of. This is using video for the first time.
Yeah.
There were 4 of us that spoke for 10 minutes each on 4 super hot burning topics that were happening to startups. It was like 2 weeks into the pandemic, 4,000 people came. I'd never been engaged in an audience like this. I was one of those 4. Did that. And then the inbound started coming. Can you do that here? Can you do that here? My job was fundraising and runway. That was what I was known for. Managing your cost base in an uncertain environment, and how do you raise money to make sure that you don't run out of money? One of the founders' key 3 jobs. Number 3, never run out of money.
Yeah.
That was my mentorship. So I ended up doing like 100 virtuals over a very short period of time, all over the place. And that became known. I published a set of notes on it, still around to this day. People would dust it off in any crisis now and so on. Really enjoyed that. But then lockdown was full force. We all understood Zoom now and how to use it. And I had this idea of writing a book about mentorship. And I was able to, I kept getting pulled away from it because it was easy to be pulled away from it. And then I decided in the summer of 2020, with lockdown, sitting in my basement, I'm going to do this project. And Anthony agreed, and so we hired a research assistant. We interviewed 150 people. It was an amazing experience just interviewing them, an hour each over that summer. And we wrote a manuscript in the fall of 2020 on the topic. I learned so much more about mentorship through that process. I'd already learned a lot in those 2 years. It was like 5 levels more of learning. We codified it, and we were going to move into an edit process when a friend of mine, all roads seem to lead back to Dal, at Creative Destruction Lab Atlantic, at Dalhousie Innovates, calls me and says, I don't think you should write a book. No one reads anymore. And I'm like, damn it. It's actually, sadly, it's kind of true.
You're about to hit print.
Yeah, exactly. And I would have had to have gone through a pretty grueling editorial process. So he said, look, I've got another idea. Let's go start a not-for-profit. There's a group in Canada called Future Skills that are funding upskilling of the Canadian economy. And we went and we did this. And the 2 of us and a third gentleman at TMU, Ryerson at the time, we went to Future Skills with a proposal. We got a nice grant, and we built what is called Mindframe Connect. We're now 3 years into it. It's long. February of 21, we got approved, if I recall, or we submitted. We launched September of 2021 with a staff of 3, added a 4th. And over the course of that period, we turned that manuscript into a dynamic set of workshops that we've delivered now. So elevating the craft of mentorship, elevating the craft of menteeship, equally important, more neglected. What about the other side of the table? Like, they are young, they're inexperienced.
Yeah.
The power dynamic issues we talked about.
Absolutely.
Right? Full workshop there. Building the skills for entrepreneurial resilience. Those were the 3, because the pandemic showed a lot of gaps in resilience, as you know, in particularly in startup land. It's been so rewarding. We've done 240 of those workshops. Over 9,000, I think now. We're getting closer to 10. And we've become the mentor programming for many organizations. And we did some stuff with POE back before they disbanded, like some of the military stuff. We've been all over the place with this. And then this year, I got that poll I mentioned at the start, Founders Play Your Own Game. I added a 4th, which is around that capital narrative. And so those 4 form the core of what I'll call my mentor inspiration to try to get better at that craft, and my impact that I focus on in our ecosystem and in my life. And it's been as rewarding a learning journey as I've ever had. And when you talk about mentorship, I'll tell you, remember how I said give back and all of that was wrong. I have learned more. I've realized I have learned more from the other side of the table in magnitudes than they've ever learned from me. And I think of mentorship as a mutual learning experience. And I love meeting people, you and I, meeting each other, hanging out, learning about you, talking about some of my background and so on. That is what I do. That's what I do with mentorship. And I do, of course, there's a constructive element to it, but I'm always learning. And so It's been extraordinarily rewarding, and I hope it's helped some people be a little more effective in the relationship.
I want to dive in a little bit to the importance of entrepreneurship in a society, in an economy. I think there's a lot of people who maybe look at starting a business, being an entrepreneur, sort of living a life that you have described, not necessarily at the scale and scope, but even something smaller, as being unattainable. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that when people look at entrepreneurship, they don't understand the importance of things like entrepreneurship, innovation, and why that's important to Canada's place in the world, to our economy. So when you have things come in, policies come in from government, or you start hearing about, potential impacts of what's going what a next U.S. administration might do, I don't think it really is something that's intellectually accessible to people, not because they're not smart enough, but just because it's not something that we talk or teach very much. So can you maybe give the listener a sense of why entrepreneurship, innovation, these sorts of qualities are important to have in Canada, and why we should foster these and invest in them?
100%. Great question. Theme of my life, really. Look, I think, if you look at the great innovations in society, what people think about a lot is some very smart, researchy type thing in some lab somewhere that is this big game changer that bonk changes society. You couldn't actually be further from the truth. What changes the game? The telephone, the light bulb, let's pick the easy ones, right? These kinds of things. What is it that they are? They are, generally speaking, maybe there's a kernel of a research idea in there that came about in some foundational way through an academic, maybe. But the reality is that they are a set of fail, learn, iterate, fail, learn, make better, with a view to ultimate commercialization. Determined by a market, ideally a free market, because it's the ultimate arbiter of what a customer will buy and benefit from. We are all selfish actors. We buy what we benefit from, and we operate that way, and it is the ultimate reckoning. And so to take that thing and then move it into what a consumer will pay for is the ultimate expression to me. Okay? And again, Canadians are amazing at certain things. We are good engineers. We're good at product. We're pretty good at the science. Hell, we got lots of AI winners. You've heard our narrative on this.
Yeah.
Where we fall down often is moving from that to the iteration of commercialization to global scale. Okay, lots to unpack. I don't have many answers on it, candidly, in a lot of cases, but that movement and having more of that creates wealth in prosperity for society, and it changes our standards of living and so on to the positive globally. That's, again, we can pull recent examples. We can look at let's just pick a few examples. And again, they often fall in the U.S.
Right.
For hook or by crook. And I love the American entrepreneurial spirit, that frontier spirit. Elon Musk, Exhibit A. Let's not talk politics. Let's not talk about the idiosyncrasies of the man on Twitter and these kinds of things. Not worth it. What is worth it is the guy took a rocket ship that is one of the largest ever made, sent it to space, and caught it back to reuse it with a set of chopsticks.
Isn't that ridiculous?
Yeah, that's innovation. And guess what? The first 4 times they tried to do that, it exploded. And then they kept doing it, learning from it and doing it again. That level of innovation, his ability to iterate, fail, make sure the money flows to allow him to keep doing that through his narrative, his story, and his credibility. That is the entrepreneurial spirit. Okay? And you look at any of these, Google in search, right? Those guys coming up with the better search algorithm and then becoming so dominant at it. Apple with what Steve Jobs did and then with what that team did and with what Cook's done now, and just that product innovation, that beautiful consumer. And we understand the benefits of this, right? We use all of this stuff. Vaccines, the whole medical, the whole health tech, all the innovation happening there. And look, if you start getting now down into the stats and you look at, let's pick the current measure that's really giving a lot of hand-wringing, GDP per capita, okay? Real GDP per capita, GDP per capita. There has been, over the last 10 years, the bifurcation in GDP per capita, US versus Canada, I think we were almost converged 10 years ago. We are so far below them now for a couple of reasons. And I think one of those reasons is numerator GDP, denominator capita, number of people. Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a denominator issue with some of the inflows we've had. They've been quite high, and the numerator doesn't pace off and as quickly when we've had this experiment that's really increased our population. But the numerator needs to go up at a compounding growth rate. And guess what? When you have a bunch of oligopolies that are foreign protected, that are not really incented to spend too much money on and invest in innovation and so on, guess what starts to falter? The numerator, GDP growth. And the US doesn't have that. They have the innovators are there, and we know them. The NVIDIA. Oh my God, Chris. NVIDIA is a $3.5 trillion company that has created in many ways, the AI revolution, right? We don't have that, right? And that is where prosperity builds and changes society, and where is that wealth? I mean, thank God you and I can go buy NVIDIA on a stock exchange, right? That's our saving grace. We have free capital flows and so on. I want us to have some NVIDIAs. So that's my view on entrepreneurship. Now, that is a little different than the one thing that's different, and it's not, I don't believe it bifurcates. But what's interesting to me is the founders play your own game narrative. Some would look at it and say, well, you know what? By not taking venture capital or not taking it as early and so on, maybe you're not actually going for it enough. You're not taking the moonshots and so on. I could bore you with my response to that. The most enduring Canadian companies, including number one, Shopify, our current generation darling. I have a quote from Toby, the founder, from 2018. He had just started to really ramp up his capital raising. He said something to the effect of, I don't know if it was bootstrapping for the first 6 years. I don't know if it was typical Canadian humility, but Shopify started as a modest company. And he bootstrapped for 6 years. When it really started to work and he saw the math of what he was doing and the program, he went and raised capital. And here we are today with Shopify. So my narrative of Founders Play Your Own Game is Toby is the poster child for this narrative because he knew how to finance his business in the early days before he understood the inflection. And when he is a human who inflected. He's a clear, that saying we said about you have to be unrecognizable to yourself every 2 years. I think that guy's unrecognizable to himself every 6 months, the pace that guy's on. And so, but when the time was right, he capitalized. We can do that. That all happened in Canada. We can do it, and we just haven't had as much success with it.
Okay, I've asked this question to a bunch of people who I've interviewed lately because of we're in the world is in election years.
Yes.
If you were advising any of the major parties in Canada about something that they could do to achieve a better ecosystem that supported innovation and entrepreneurship, what is 1, 2, I don't know, whatever your list of things is to do?
It's a long list, but I'll give you a macro priority. Number one is I would do some targeted significant deregulation initiatives. Okay, so to pull a Reagan, I think it was, you have to remove 2 regulations for every one you add, which is it kind of makes an interesting point, right? It's like you didn't need that other part, but you needed it just to prove a point. They struck a commission about 10 years ago that looked at some of the regulatory issues. Alberta, arguably our most freewheeling province, between Fed and provincial regulation around this one environmental issue, there were 13 regs dealing with the same issue that someone would have had to have complied with. I would want to take a scythe through our regulatory environment, and I would err on the side of actually being a little dangerous in some ways. Like a hairstylist, I was talking to a restaurant in my area in Toronto. The hoops they're running through are just stupid. I would cut that all back. I would cut the fees that we charge all these guys, all that friction, cut her right back. That would be a huge policy program, number one. Number two, this is controversial. Number two, I would look at every one of these oligopolies, and you and I have talked about that for probably half this podcast. You know where my bias lies, having fought in that world. I would be, if Air Canada, okay, so let's just talk about airlines.
Sure.
Okay, Air Canada has, Canadian-owned airlines have a monopoly on, or an oligopoly on domestic routes. Okay, so here's the deal, Air Canada. First of all, I'd cut that right back. I think that's silly. If we want to have strategic airline assets, I think you affect those through other means. Okay, I'd probably just deregulate it and open it up to foreigners. Okay, but let's say that I wanted to be a little more, I don't know, discerning. Canadian. Yeah, more discerning. Well, I would no longer allow strikes on domestic routes. So Air Canada almost had a strike, right? Remember all that chaos that caused for people where it was the last minute. You probably got caught in it. I did. You have a domestic route that you fly with a protected scenario. All that strike stuff is over. Right. That's labor. You're protected. Okay. And I figure out my ways. Telecom, you can imagine my thoughts on that. Banks, we pride ourselves on this prudential banking system that doesn't have failures. Look, if you have 0 failures in 100 years, it means there's no risk being taken. To give you a data point, the return on equity investment of a branch in Canada is double that of the US. And that's reflected in our bank fees, bank revenues, all this kind of stuff. I have this vision of the bank CEOs sitting in a room like the Wizard of Oz. And it's like, okay, earnings aren't growing as fast as I want. Okay, which ATM fee are we going to crank? A little dial that goes from $1. It's probably now $3. I don't really take cash out anymore. No. I'm going to turn that up to $3.50. And that just all that stuff is crazy. So I would have this massive deregulation thing. I would have an attitude of getting out of the way rather than putting more government overreach in as a general philosophy in the government. I would cut the living crap out of the public sector. It's growing so much, so far, so fast, and it creates tax burden on the rest of us. And the tax burden, I would start cutting back, personal and corporate, or personal and particularly capital gains and some of the corporate stuff. And I think at that point, I would take a step back and see what happened.
Now, what are some of the risks associated with like a significant level of material deregulation? What are some of the risks that would be associated with that? Because as you said, if there's no risks, then we're probably have overinsured ourselves in many ways.
So look, is it personal injury in certain scenarios that may not have happened in incredibly rare instances? I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example in that regard. There might be some stuff like that. I would hope it would be minimized. That one we'd be very thoughtful of. Okay. Bank failure. What happens if a bank fails? Right? That has to be allowed to happen in a more competitive ecosystem. Okay. That would be an example. Generally speaking, I think, look to the U.S. and quantify what you think about risks down there in some areas. I'd do healthcare differently here and there. I'd go much more hybrid, and I'd use in Australia or Switzerland or a few others as an example. There's probably a few other things that create inordinate risk down there that I wouldn't copy. But it's a more free form with a little bit more of an individualistic approach. And so is there a little more room for maybe a fraud or a scam? Yes. Would I try to be pretty consequential with managing that and policing that and so on? I think that's kind of how they do it. I'd probably fall more to their model. That's how I would think about it. But there is risk. We are not here to take life risk to zero, right? We cross the street every day. You have those fluke things that happen. It is part of life. And I'm not trying to protect society from all of it in ridiculous ways.
So I'm mindful of time here, but I do want to ask you one. We actually started the last podcast with this, and it sort of dovetails nicely into the de-risking of life.
Right.
But about sort of, because I asked you about what's your morning routine.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Right.
So this is we had a great conversation on it, but I would love to sort of maybe wrap up on that part about what your morning routine looks like and how it's sort of developed into that.
Yeah, right. So that was right. We jumped right in. Yeah, that was a good one. So here's where I'll say it, and then let's take a step back on the evolution. So my morning routine. So again, I'm fortunate position where I'm not sweating 100-hour weeks into an operating business anymore. Right. And that's actually been pretty important to me to move a little bit away from that, not to get caught back into that, because I've learned a lot about personal health in that narrative. So let me preface it with that. My personal routine is a get up, hang out with my wife, very important to me, for like a half an hour to up to an hour. Socialize with her, eat a very healthy, kind of nutritious breakfast program with her, have my coffee, that kind of thing. There is always exercise in my routine, whether it's morning, afternoon, night, depends, but frequently morning. Mm-hmm. And we can talk a little more about what that means. I am very keyed on getting an adequate amount of sleep, so the wake-up timing and so on. And I like some structure in all of that to create certain bodily repetition. Okay, so so socialization with your comment about
fire team partner.
My fire team partner, 27 years. Yeah. Healthy eating, good sleep, and exercise. Those would be my pillars of a morning.
Yeah, I really love that balance. Even for people who don't have access to maybe the similar level of resources you do, I think establishing what's important to you, family, taking care of yourself, eating as well as you can, whatever that, 3 or 4 lifestyle choices are, like investing in yourself, investing in your relationships is really good. And the way you've laid that out, I think, is super helpful. And people can just try and make a better choice, not do it all at once. That becomes really overwhelming, but maybe find that thing that's most important to you, eating a little better, spending a little bit more time with your spouse, whatever that looks like. And that there's a U.S. general, a guy named Paul Funk, and one of his truisms was secure yourself first. So secure your relationships, secure your health, secure those sorts of things that are all important to you, because life is too short. So if you spend some time figuring out what is important to you and investing in those, I think you're just going to have a more fulfilling life, a healthier life, and hopefully a longer life. We talked about Peter T. a little bit last time. Yes. And I love his book, Outlive. Outlive.
It was the game changer for me.
Yeah, health span versus lifespan.
That's right. Health span. Lifespan is how long you live. Health span is the quality of those years, ideally right to the end. Mm-hmm. And it was a revelation to me, maybe not dissimilar to some of the mentoring stuff we talked about. And after reading that book, I started to make adjustments. And then an interesting thing happened. I can't remember if we talked about this. After exits and so on, I hooked up with a group of exited founders in southwestern Ontario that the peer groups. There's a lot of these things around, and I've really enjoyed it because it's a shared experience, and it's all people kind of moving from I went 1,000 miles an hour and all I did was build a business and that's my identity to I exited. I've now got some wealth and what's next? So there's 35 of us, and I was into this, starting to build this longevity routine and learning about it. And we do an annual retreat, and we were talking about this as a topic. A lot of people are talking about this, right? Peter Attia, it's a game-changing book in terms of just knowledge of the topic. So I was really getting into it, and we were looking for a speaker, and originally it was going to be some expert. And then the guys knew I was kind of getting into it, and they said, hey, why don't you do this? And I said, do the citizen thing. What have you learned, and how would you do this? Or what should we take away from this? Action-oriented, all this stuff. So I don't take this stuff lightly. I signed up for it, and I ended up using it as my research platform to really learn this. Okay, and maybe some might argue I went a little overboard. It ended up turning out to be a 270 slider. 500 hours of research or more. And it's actually set me up to this day. Like the Peter Attia podcast, which is like crazy. You almost feel like you're a doctor by the end of that. I subscribe to it. I pay for it.
Yeah.
It's pretty heavy.
It's dense.
It's dense.
There's no doubt.
And I figured out how to do it a little faster with the notes and so on. But I got really into it. And then something happened with the group. This was when I did it in January of this year. So 2024. Mid-2023, one person in the group ended up having a heart attack. Thankfully survived. Really got the revelation moment that happens, and has really gone full in on this. So he and I ended up splitting it up. We did it together. He focused on heart and medical concierge, and I focused on everything else. And we distilled it down to 10 subject areas. We started with this big explanation, which is really, if I summarize, the problem in society is the habits that we have that end up resulting in chronic disease. What did we figure out? We figured out infectious disease for a lot of it. We figured out emergency room medicine and so on. What have we not done well?
Lifestyle.
Smoking.
Yeah.
Lack of exercise, sedentary. Our world moved in a way that was basically counter to all of our genetics.
The slow burn stuff.
The slow burn. One of my favorite expressions comes from the Warren Buffett world. Never interrupt compounding. The lifestyle stuff is negative compounding. So I always say about negative lifestyle, interrupt compounding. Right? Interrupt negative compounding. Don't interrupt positive compounding, interrupt negative. And so we did this thing. And look, it was pretty profound for me because, again, like the mentor thing, I learned it. And then when you do the research and write and then turn it into a thing, there's these sayings about if you write, it changes how you think and you learn more about a topic. I kind of embrace that. And I don't actually have a big research. Founders Play Your Own Game was my last one. Prior to that was longevity. I got to find a new one soon. So I'm always listening for things. But it was gratifying. And I mean, we could spend minutes summarizing the learnings and so on, but I think everyone can make changes in their lives. They can do it incrementally. Results take time. They will happen. There's no instant gratification here. And I am a huge believer that we can take control of that stuff.
All right, Brice, I know you're on
Is that time?
the timeline.
Perfect.
And
perfect, my friend.
Hey, this has been fantastic. I'm glad we got to connect in person because it's so much better when we get to do this face-to-face. There's no doubt.
Love it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story with the listeners. Thanks for being a champion of things like entrepreneurship, innovation, mentoring, mentees. And I think there's a lot of people out there probably cheering your deregulation of telcos. I know there's a lot of military families out there who certainly are. And thanks for being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Awesome. Chris, love what you're doing. Great to do it in person. And let's stay in touch and kind of keep hanging out.
Awesome. Will do.
Take care.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Brice. Please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.